Online for Authors. I'm chatting with Larry Bograd, author of Blood Flow. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. Enjoyed the book.
Thank
but
you.
Before we really start into it and talk about much, let's do like a quick elevator pitch. If someone's going to open up this cover, what are they going to find?
They're going to find a memoir that has taken me several decades to write and rewrite and update and things like that. The main story I have to tell is of my father's suicide 2 weeks past my 13th birthday. He had been hospitalized for depression and came home on an ill-advised day pass. It wasn't, I feel I had a really good childhood, actually, in spite of that. I have two siblings, a sister a year older, a brother a year younger. None of us knew really about how bad his mental health was. And as I started talking to other relatives, and my mother was very helpful, and family friends, I did a lot of traveling. I unearthed what turned out to be 2 prior hospitalization records for my dad, one in 1949 and one in 1962 when I was 8 or 9 years old. Yeah. That while he was alive, my siblings I knew nothing about. So there was a lot of secrets. Some were well-intended, kept secrets. Some were privacy issues. But I also traveled to Europe. My father was born in Eastern Europe, came to this country when he was 3. So I went to Trieste, Italy, where my dad, who's the doctor, was stationed with the occupation forces after World War II, and he toured a lot of the displaced persons camps after the Holocaust.
Yeah. And
when he came home from that, he had his first nervous breakdown. And then I also went all the way to Eastern Europe, the little town it's been part of Romania, it's been part of Ukraine, it's been part of the Soviet Union, is now part of Moldavia, where he was born. I was 19 at the time and very naively had this fantasy that I would probably run into somebody who had lived there all their life, a Jew, who had somehow avoided the Bolsheviks, the pogroms, the Nazis, spoke English, knew my family, and could tell me a lot about my dad. So anyway, I wrote a version of this book when I was 19. I've kind of updated it every decade, most recently a couple of years ago. And as my own life evolved, some of those episodes also ended up in the book. So that's a long-winded answer to a short question.
No, but you know, that really talks a lot about this book, because one of my questions to you was going to be, how long did it take you to write this book? And so the answer is decades.
Yeah, you know, I wrote a version when I was 19 years old, which was a kind of bad novel.
Yeah.
Kind of, you know, I was 19, right? But it's always been useful to me because at that point, the years between his suicide and my age when I wrote that version was only about 5 years.
Right.
But the details were still very vibrant. And so a lot of the stuff that ended up in the book that was published, relied on that level of detail.
Right. Right. Things that go away with time, that you just don't hold on to all of those memories you still had very clearly just 5-6 years later.
Exactly. Now, and also, and sadly, a lot of people go through trauma. Some have lasting effects, but those events too kind of lock into your memory.
Yeah.
So I can very easily recreate moments from now almost 60 years ago. In pretty vibrant detail. So I think between those two sources, I was able to put a lot into the book, and over the years add a more adult sensibility about the events, understanding. And then strangely enough, when I was 53, I had an unexpected triple bypass, cardiac surgery, open heart surgery. So then the narrative kind of went between my dad's story, my search for his story, my own heart issues,
Right.
So things like that. So that's kind of also where the title Blood Flow comes through too.
Absolutely. I'm curious, what prompted you at 19 to decide you wanted to write about it? And then what do you think kept you fueled to continue it for decades until you finally got it out?
Well, I mean, there's a practical answer to that, and then there's a kind of artistic answer to that. The practical answer is I got hired to be a lifeguard at a new townhouse development being built on the prairie east of Denver. And it was behind schedule, and none of the units were done, much less occupied. But they had a contract to have the clubhouse and pool open all summer. So I had a lot of time that summer to take notes and think about things.
Mm-hmm.
Artistically, you know, I don't know if it's accurate or not, but I always had the feeling that with my dad's suicide kind of freed me up to do what I wanted with my life. You know, I could have easily followed his path into medicine if I was smart enough, you know, or some kind of professional channel like that. But I always enjoyed the creative arts. I started as a little kid doing cartooning, and I was in theater for a while. And then I started writing a little bit towards my senior year in high school. So it just seemed like a good medium for me to explore the story.
Right, right.
And then, you know, over the years, as I indicated, I also learned a lot about being a writer. I mean, not only did I publish a lot of other books, mostly for kids and young adults, but I was a book editor in New York. I lived in New York for 9 years and came back to Denver, where I became a college professor teaching creative writing. You know, I had a lot to learn myself. I don't think there are natural born writers. Maybe if you're lucky, you're one of them, Terry, but
I don't know that it's natural born. I didn't get my first book out until I was almost 60. So I'm not sure that counts.
Yeah. You know, I've always had to work hard at becoming a better writer, but I've also, almost without exception, had a good time when I write.
Yeah.
I've always felt for writers who feel that sitting down to write or the blank page is like torture.
Oh no, if it feels like torture, then I don't write.
Good for you.
I'm not a daily writer. There are some days where I think, no, my characters are not speaking to me today. And if I sit down and write, I'll throw it all away. And I have zero desire to throw away something I've spent time writing. Right. And so I wait until my characters are cooperative, and then we sit down and we write together. And it's a lot of fun for me. So, yeah. It's kind of the way I do it. I don't know. I've been told by people who claim to be more of an author than I am that, you know, I should write every day. And it's like, except it doesn't work for me. And, you know, I think about writing every day. And so sometimes I do what I call writing in my head, and I'm trying out different scenarios and things, and I take them to a place, and it's like, yeah, it's not going to work. And then I'm doing writerly things, but I'm not necessarily sitting at my computer. So.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same thing. I don't necessarily write every day. I've also had to have jobs, you know, along the way.
Yeah.
But I do find that something comes to me and I'll jot 2 or 3 lines down on a piece of paper and come back to it and kind of let it percolate. And
that's the word I use too. I always let things percolate. It's just like, oh now I'm ready, you know, and when I get ready, I can write for hours and hours, like don't need anything from me because I am busy now. But when it's gone, then I just don't worry with it because it'll come back. I just, you know, I need more perk time.
You know, as you know, there's kind of competing guidance on this.
Yeah.
Some people just say, write.
Yeah.
You know, don't worry about editing. Don't worry about grammar. Don't worry about that. And other people, I do think, tend to do this percolation approach where they want to be ready to write.
Yeah.
You know, one thing I discovered is, and I think it was a Hemingway deal, but I always stop writing before I'm done for the day.
Yeah, I've heard that before, that you're supposed to stop with, and I haven't tried that. I write until the last word is just dry. And then I'm like, okay, I'm done for now. And then I walk away, and I feel fine walking away because I know that when I come back, I'm going to have a whole nother day of writing to go because I will have been thinking about it until I'm ready. I love a writer's retreat. I love being able to go away for like 2 weeks and nobody needs me because nobody expects me to be home. So there's no laundry. There's nobody who wants food. The dog doesn't need to go out. There's none of those things that can distract me. And I can write for 2 solid weeks and never run out of anything to say. But at home, it's so much harder because I'll hear the bell on the dryer and I'll think, oh, I need to go fold those clothes. And someone will call and they'll say, hey, are you home? And it's very hard to say no when you're sitting at home and all of the things that just distract me. So, yeah, I tell everyone I'm a binge writer.
So you live so close to the ocean. Where do you go to retreat?
Anywhere. I tell people I can retreat literally anywhere. It just can't be in my house.
Huh.
I just need to get away from here. I have a retreat that I've been to. It's in Southern Pines. That's the middle of North Carolina. And it's a lovely old mansion. A lot of writers have been there and done their writing there. And on my way there, I feel myself, like by the time I arrive, I can hardly get up to the room fast enough because I'm so ready to write. But I think it's just knowing that I now have this freedom and this time. I'm just a very busy person and it's hard to find the space in my head because I'll look at my calendar and I'll think, well, I got this to do and this to do and this to do. And, and when I'm on these retreats, I've cleared my calendar. There's nothing there.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I've done pretty well as an author, but I've never made much money at it.
Yeah, well, that's
and so I kind of learned over the years to just kind of that I can basically write anywhere. I can write on airplanes. I used to write on buses in New York City. If I have an hour, I can get some stuff done. My wife, Colleen Hubbard, who's a wonderful writer in her own right, is more like the percolation school, where, if I say to her, oh, well, we're free this afternoon, why don't you go do something? And she'll just look at me like I'm nuts. You're like,
yeah, like I
wasn't
wasn't
thinking
about that. Right. I can write anywhere, but I have to have it in my head already. Like I've got something going around right now, and I'm based on how I feel. It's going to be 2 or 3 days, and all of a sudden I'm gonna have this need to sit down. And if you told me, okay, well, it's going to be in a coffee shop, that doesn't bother me. I can be anywhere. I have a harder time at home though, and I just think it's because at home there's a lot of competing things. People that need me and things that need doing, and yeah,
there's laundry to do. There's a refrigerator upstairs.
There's just all the things. It's just really hard to say I am now carving out this space for myself. But if I'm not home, I don't know, immediately it's like, oh, I'm not home, I can write. So I try to carve out space, definitely.
Well, if I ever get to your neighborhood and knock on your door and you're not there, I'll know that
I'm off writing somewhere. That's true.
That's right. Right.
So I'm curious, in all of this, you obviously did a lot of interviews with people that knew your dad. Is there anything that you learned about your dad that you found like completely surprising? You were not expecting to hear that.
I'd say one of the main things that I learned that was new to me was that family and friends were concerned about his mental health for decades.
Yeah.
After his first nervous breakdown around 1949, I interviewed 2 of his first cousins that I met once, really just for the purpose of the interview. And they talk about taking him out to the boardwalk in Brooklyn. And the female cousin just kept saying to my dad, you don't have to practice medicine. You can be a researcher. You don't need the pressure. So clearly there was a lot of concern about he had a lot of, he just didn't seem to ever have much confidence, even though he was considered one of the better doctors in town at the time,
Yeah.
So I think that was one thing that I learned, was just that a lot of people were kind of monitoring, and he was probably a little bit bipolar too. One of the surprising things I learned from my mother, my parents liked to entertain and have people over.
Yeah.
They even had a little built-in mini bar and all that kind of stuff. But my mother told me later that those were often impromptu invitations because my my dad would either be depressed and she wanted him to be surrounded by friends, or he would be in a kind of manic swing and wanted, hey, let's have a good time.
Let's have a party. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of those kind of nuances of his personality that came out with the details that other people provided.
Yeah. And as a child, those are the kinds of things that we don't notice about parents. You know,
Right.
right. I mean, you know, as an 8-year-old, when you said, you know, your dad was in a mental hospital and you were unaware, I mean, kids can walk around totally unaware of what's going on around them just because they're kids. First of all, no one's really sharing all of facts. And then second of all, children of that age are very self-centered, not in a bad way. I mean, this is just the way kids are, right? And as long as it didn't affect you directly, like you were still getting up, you were still going to school, you were still doing life. It didn't, you know, and someone told you, hey, dad's, you know, doing some things somewhere else for a couple of weeks. And you're like, oh, okay, no problem. And it's just the way it goes. My mother tells the story. I mean, very different, but she was 11 years old when her baby brother was born. And my mother had no idea that her mother was pregnant. I said, how? Yeah. And she said, well, first of all, it wasn't talked about. You know, my mother will be, well, she just turned 82. So she said, you know, back when I was a kid, people weren't talking about pregnancy. You didn't bring it up. She said, Mom wore a you know, bigger dress and an apron. And I don't know. She said, I came home from school one day and was told that I had a new brother. And I thought, I can't even, you know, that's so hard, but it's that same kind of thing where no one told her and it didn't affect how she was living day-to-day life. And so it wasn't something that was on her radar.
You know, in the book, I sometimes take little pauses for a short chapter of reflection.
Yes.
And at some point I say to the fact that when you're a kid, the one thing you need to know about your parents is that they're there.
Yeah.
And after that, the details are kind of like,
Yeah, as long as they were there. You know, your mom was home when you got home from school and dad came home from work. And, you know, it sounds like you had wonderful trips together and he did things with his boys and took them to the ball games and things like that. So for you, you would have been hard pressed to look back and say, well, when was this happening?
Right, exactly.
Because those aren't the memories that you were storing.
And I remember at the dinner party when my dad would kind of like draw, you kids have it so lucky. When I was your age, yeah. You know, one of my siblings and I would say, oh, Dad, another poor boy story. We're actually, it might have been good to have heard those, but you know how it is. Again, you're just kind of, you're at an age where your parents are not the most interesting people in the world.
No, absolutely not. And you don't want to hear about walking uphill both ways to school. It's just not something, you know, in the snow, no less, right?
Exactly.
So I'm curious, in all of this, you did a lot of, you know, looking at your dad. What did you learn about yourself that you found most interesting?
That's a good question. You know, I guess I kind of learned what I have inherited or environmentally inherited from both my parents. You know, I think there's a time maybe in adolescence or thereabout where you kind of really think like, I'm my own person. You know, I'm creating myself and all that kind of stuff. Right. But, you know, with time, I think I've learned a lot about myself. You know, I haven't had the kind of, I've had some depressive episodes, but nothing like what my dad went through. So, and I think I also learned a lot of resilience. I mean, I think sometimes it's easy to look at somebody who has a history of mental illness and say, you know, poor kid, poor guy, never got his act together. But it takes a lot of resilience.
Yes. To
recover. So I think I inherited a lot of that from both my parents, who were Depression era kids. I think I also, my dad was kind of a kitchen table poet. And my mother was very into the arts and took my siblings and I to a lot of music and theater. So again, I think there's a lot of those threads that explained why I ended up doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you've been an author for a long time. I know. I mean, I went back and I looked and I'm looking at the dates of these books and it's like, I saw one in 1978. I don't know when your first one came out.
That's about right.
That's about right. Okay. So Yeah, so I was looking back and I said, okay, so he's been an author a long time, mostly, like you said, children's, young, not even really young adult as much as like children and older child.
Well,
Right?
actually,
Did you do much young adult?
I did 3 picture books
Mm-hmm.
where I was just the author.
Yeah.
And totally serendipitously, the first one won a Best Book of the Children's Book of the Year award, which got me into the New York Times, which I thought, this is how it happens,
Right.
Tomorrow Hollywood will be calling me, right?
And yet no call.
Oh, exactly. But my first book was about a kid who gets locked in the attic. We don't really know why, but he creates this alternative life for himself up there. He collects rainwater and he builds furniture and he reads. And when they unlock the door, he's not so sure he wants to go downstairs. It's just a fantasy, like a Sindak book, right?
Yeah.
Well, that got a lot of raves and won this award, but it also got hate mail. Like, how dare you write a book about child abuse? And
child locked in the closet. Yeah, or locked in the attic, right? Yeah.
I remember once I was living in New York and I got a manila envelope and from a school in Pennsylvania somewhere, and I thought, oh, how nice, some fan mail. And I wrote it up, and it was like 12 letters written on big chief tablets saying, "You wrote a bad book. You should not share this book with children." It's like, thank you, teacher, for the prompt for the penmanship lesson.
Seriously. Oh, goodness. How funny.
But then I also did, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I also did 5 novels for young adults.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And then I did 3 what you were calling like older kids, what might be called middle grade readers. I did 3 of those as well.
Fantastic. So you wrote those. Now you've written this memoir. Which did you like of all the different genres now that you've written? What did you like most and why?
Well, I actually like adult literary fiction. I've written a couple novels which unfortunately haven't been published, but I kind of compare it to I never really understood how someone could compose a symphony until I tried to write like a 300 or 400 page novel, where you really understand a lot more about pacing and when to highlight things and when to take a rest and things. So I think I kind of like that as a big complicated project.
Yeah. Do you have any plans right now to write any more of those big, complicated projects?
Well, I have one in the wings. I wrote a couple of years ago that I might revisit, a historical novel.
Fantastic. I love historical. That's what I write most of. It's people will often say to me that, oh, you're a historical fiction author. And I say, no, I'm a character-driven fiction author whose characters happen to have landed in history the last 3 books, but that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. Is there an era you love more than
no, it's really strange. I get a character in my head and they tell me where they belong and then we just go with it. And so my one was written actually in 1970, which just hurts my soul that that's considered historical fiction. Can you believe it? 1970.
No, I was in high school.
Well, and I was a 10-year-old, so it was like, oh my gosh, this. But anyway, and then I wrote a World War II, and then I wrote one in the 1890s in the Appalachian Mountains. So there isn't any, I don't know. I just have a character, and the character says, "Hey, by the way, this is who I am and where I live and what I'm doing. So let's go." And that's how I write. I think maybe who knows? There might be mental health issues in that head because I've got characters that live in there and talk to me. So,
one of my young adult novels called Los Alamos Light takes place in World War II. It's about a girl whose mother had recently committed suicide, whose father's a physicist who's recruited by Oppenheimer to come out to New Mexico to help build the bomb. So that was very enjoyable for me. I suspect you do a fair amount of research when you get into it.
And I tell people, I think the reason that I started in a historical, like that's kind of where I started, is I love research and I love writing. And when you can marry 2 things together that you really love doing, there's a lot of fun with that. And I get a real charge out of finding a fact that I look at and think, oh my gosh, that's how I'm going to move my story forward. that fact is going to be the thing. That's the thing, and when I find that, so I'm doing research and I'll see this fact and my mind will just start racing with, oh, and then I could do this, and then I could do this. And so for me, I think it's just that. It's like a treasure hunt.
I don't know about you, but I often find like really good plot ideas in footnotes.
Yes.
Where the author's, he's got a major through line he's trying to follow, but he wants readers to be aware of like a little aside.
And that little aside, you're like,
sometimes just like, well, I got to follow that up,
Yeah, yeah. My biggest thing with research that I have to be careful is that I don't keep researching and neglect to write. Because I can fall down in those rabbit holes. And the next thing you know, I started out maybe in some little town in Ohio in the 1930s. And the next thing you know, who knows where I am, right? Like I've gone down a hole, I'm off somewhere else, I'm doing something completely different. And it's like, whoa. Okay, cut that off, put it aside. You can look that up later, get back to what you're doing. It can get really, but I enjoy it. I've always loved learning. And research to me, it's like taking a class and you're just learning all of these cool facts and figuring out how they all fit together. So,
yeah, I don't know if you know the term autodidact, but that's basically where you teach yourself.
Yes.
And that's probably been my best way to learn.
Yeah. I love learning that way. I also love it if I get a professor who is good at storytelling and they can give me a lot of facts and do it in a way where I felt more like I was being read a really great story. So a good storyteller to me is another really good way to learn. And I think that's another reason I like to write, is that idea where you can give this story to someone and now they can learn something from it. What are they going to get from this thing that I've written? So
you said you published your first book when you were 60. Were you a creative kid? I mean, were you writing all this?
Oh, well, yeah, I wrote bad poetry as a child, like all kids do. And, I think what happened is I ended up going, I got married, I had children, I got divorced. Life just wasn't such that writing was ever going to be something I had time for. I got remarried. I was in a horrible relationship. It was emotionally abusive. And when I finally got out of that relationship, like words started pouring out of me. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And then I published my first book in 22. So, I mean, I'm 61 now. So I was 58 years old and I got my first book out there. And now I've got 4 books and a children's picture book is about to come out. So yeah, it's like now it's just falling out of me. So I can hardly keep up with myself.
Yeah. It's good to hear because I'm almost 72 and I still have creative juices. They're probably not as insane as they once were, but it's still a wonderful outlet. It's a wonderful thing.
I think so. Yeah.
It's also a wonderful thing to think about, especially in the crazy times we live in, how important the arts are and how creativity may yet show us ways to, to move ahead and
absolutely
live together.
When you have a reader pick up this book and they've now read it and they put it down, what do you hope that they've gotten from it?
Well, I think from a kind of selfish point of view, hopefully they'll realize that I came out of a very traumatic situation and created a very whole life.
Yeah.
I really have a happy life. Part of that is deeply because of my wife and our wonderful 3 daughters, who we call ourselves the Pod.
Yeah, I know. I love that.
we're just lucky. I mean, we've been all healthy. We've have a good time together. We're incredibly supportive and loving. My mother lived to be 100, almost 102, and it took almost to the end of her age for her to say, "I love you," even though I kind of knew it.
Yeah, to actually be able to say the words out loud.
My sister would be out visiting, and she'd say, "Mom, Larry's leaving. Tell him I love you." but in our pod, it just comes so easily between us.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I don't think trauma has to define your life.
Right.
It definitely shifts it, and sometimes it can potentially ruin your life. But if you have the fortitude, and if you're fortunate and get some help, It doesn't have to define your life.
Right. Right. I tell people that there is light on the other side of trauma. And, if it's what you want, if you want to find that light, there are ways to do that. It isn't necessarily easy, but there is light on that other side. So yeah. And that book, your book did feel that way.
Oh, thank you.
As I was reading it. Yeah.
I think another thing that would be nice if people came away with is sometimes people get locked into attitude towards family members.
Yeah.
Parents in particular, and don't really understand how full their lives were or are, and
Right.
the kind of experiences they had and the different world that they grew up in. So, again, it works for some people, it doesn't work for other people, but I think it's always good if you can, talk to people that you've known a long time, but really don't know their story, and just kind of say, you know what, can we sit down and there's always been things I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
And hopefully they'll be open to that conversation.
Well, and to be able to learn a little more about people around you and find out like what actually makes them tick, what makes them the way they are, because sometimes we have this idea about who someone is. And once you learn the why behind it, it changes everything about the way you see them. Right.
I remember years and years ago when I was in Europe on this trip I mentioned, I stayed at a B&B in England somewhere, and I talked to the woman who ran it, and I said, how long you lived in this town? She said, I've lived here my whole life. I thought to myself, being an arrogant teenager, oh, how boring. Right. And then one day she, in the afternoon, she invited people in for a cup of tea, and she opened up and said, I was a nurse in Burma during the war, and I, traveled here and there, and I met these people. It's just like, yeah, until you ask, you may
don't
know all
right?
the layers of these people, strangers or people you know.
Absolutely. So, hey, everyone, if you want to keep this book conversation going, head on over to Novels and Latte Book Club on Facebook. There you'll have a chance to win a digital copy of Larry's book, Blood Flow. So, Larry, if someone wanted to get in touch with you and talk with you about this book or your other books or writing in general or all the things that you would have to share with them with all your years of experience, how do they do that?
Well, I have a website, which I assume will be in your notes, Terry, but it's just my name, larrybograd.com. It just actually went live this week. So
fantastic.
People can go there, learn more about the book, about me. My other creative works are listed there, and also family photos are up there just for fun. But there is a contact form where people can contact me. I do make an effort to get back to people.
Yeah, you do.
And I'm definitely at a point in my life and in my career where I don't want to be anyone's security blanket, but I'm also happy to be a mentor and offer people what little advice is worthy that
Wonderful. And Larry's right. All of those will be in the show notes. So definitely look down there and run right out and grab a copy of Blood Flow. Be sure that you review it because we love those reviews. And Larry, I want to thank you so much for being with me today.
Well, it's been a joy, Terry. Thank you for your time and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.